Hello everyone, and thank you for joining. We will begin today's webinar at 3 minutes past the hour to give everyone a little bit of time to join. Feel free to grab a drink in the meantime and get yourself comfortable. We'll begin shortly. Thank you. Hello everyone and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Applying AI and Search in Europe. Today we will hear from Simon Taylor, VP of Channel and Alliances for Lucidworks, and Matt Aslett, VP of Research from 451 Research. I want to highlight the Q&A box available for you to use throughout the webinar in the interface. If you have any questions, please pop them into here, and towards the end, we'll address these. Without further ado, I will pass over to Simon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sabrina, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat with everyone today. Hi, everyone. So before I hand over to Matt, I'm going to take the sort of first few minutes here to sort of talk a little bit about what search and AI means in Europe, and certainly the application in the current times that we find ourselves in today. So first of all, let's just talk about that a little bit, because when we first planned this webinar, things were very different, and obviously we now find ourselves in a situation where businesses or doing business is very virtual, changed considerably online. So I really wanted to address that, and also, I'd be a bit remiss if I didn't hope that everybody on this call was safe and virtual and working from home as much as possible, and I hope everyone is. So let's talk about that a little bit, because we are now living in a very different world in terms of the challenges we face, certainly from a digital transformation, search and AI perspective. And I wanted to highlight some of this with you today, because it's very pertinent, and this is research of the last sort of four weeks or so. So the first one is to do with digital transformation itself. Obviously, a lot of people thought about transformation as being one of those things nice to have, or they would eventually get there. And as a result, there's quite a lot of the market that's still in that planning stage, although that may have accelerated fairly significantly over the last 4 weeks. But it's a challenge for most organizations. In fact, I was reading another bit of research last week that almost suggested that in the UK particularly, 62% of organizations are struggling to enable the virtual workforce. So that was quite interesting. And then Obviously, the second point here is that a lot of consumers are concerned with protecting their data. That seems to be very pertinent right now as well. So when you're transforming to a virtual workforce, it's quite hard to enable protection of privacy, certainly when you're trying to do it quickly. So there's been a sort of a trend in that area. 76% of consumers have highlighted the fact that they would work with an online vendor, but also that doesn't necessarily translate to doing more business, or if it does, it's in specific segments. So we're seeing essential segments like food, for example, and other areas to do with home supply going up, and then things like clothing going down as people prioritize what they buy online. But the general trend is more to online consumption, which is great. And then 47% of digital aware consumers would prefer virtual assistants, and they're getting frustrated with long call center delays. I was actually just working with a retailer yesterday where normally I'd get through in 2 or 3 minutes, and the average wait time was 42 minutes. So very different times we live in, but of course virtual ways in giving and disseminating information to people are quite important. So what that translates to is really measured digital performance relative to customer experience. Obviously, people wanting to really understand how best to improve that and in the right ways. Very much a personalized approach as well, which means understanding individual needs. We'll talk a little bit about that later in the session today. Very much around information dissemination through digital virtual assistants. It's no surprise around the world that various different leaders in different countries, they only need to announce a certain directive or a certain perspective on something, and it can create significant call volume of people requiring information or having some uncertainty around what that information means to them, which can be better disseminated to things like virtual environments and virtual assistants. And then finally, working from home, the improved information access is the largest challenge, because candidly a lot of organizational systems haven't transformed into a state where they are easy to adapt from a virtual perspective. So what this all means is that we live in a very different world, and it's quite hard to transition to a virtual digital workplace, and it's challenging. And with that, I'm now going to pass over to Matt, who's going to spend a little bit of time just introducing you to the 451 group, but also giving you his perspectives on what it means to really look at that world today. So Matt, over to you.
I'm Matt Aslett. I'm Research VP for Data, AI, and Analytics Channel. But 451 Research overall is a multifaceted IT research and advisory company. We were founded back in 2000, so now heading towards our 20th year. We have around 250 employees and serve more than 1,000 clients across the IT sector. In doing so, we publish over 52 million data points each quarter, and over 4,500 reports each year, which enables us to cover more than 2,000 technology and service providers across a range of topics. So zeroing in on the focus of the webinar today, so we're going to be talking about data and analytics, obviously, but particularly in relation to the way in which we see it being used to accelerate digital transformation, and in particular, some of the issues related to AI, machine learning adoption, and some of the barriers to organizations both in EMEA but also in North America in terms of taking advantage of the opportunities there are to become more data driven and to get more business insight from the increasing volumes of data that they have available to them. So with that as a backdrop, obviously one of the key trends we see is this shift towards sort of digital transformation. And we start off with this slide, which is a data point from our Voice of the Enterprise Data Platforms and Analytics survey that we conducted earlier this year. And really wanted to start here because this really makes the point pretty well, I think. I hope that digital transformation, while it is something that obviously a lot of people talk about, I think it's fine to roll your eyes when you hear the term digital transformation. Again, there's a lot of companies talking the talk about it. But the important thing here is that it's something that companies are absolutely executing on as well. And as you can see, 92% of enterprises that we surveyed are currently executing or developing digital transformation strategies. So it's not just a bit of hype. It's not just something that companies talk about. As you can see, 43% of companies are actually in the execution phase in terms of their digital transformation strategies. Another 27% evaluating, 22% considering. And so I think the key point here is if you're in that 8% that doesn't have currently a strategy in relation to digital transformation, this kind of statistic should be causing alarm bells. If you're in that 8% that really haven't even started yet, then what this shows is that the majority of your competitors probably have. And I would actually argue, if you're also in that 22% that are already considering it, you should also be concerned because either digital native startups or the existing companies that are in that 43% and 27% that are executing or evaluating are likely or more likely to perhaps survive the competitive environment given the shift towards digital transformation than those that don't. Another key trend, obviously, we're increasing their use of data to drive strategic decision making. Of course, this is happening across the board, companies of all sizes in all regions. We actually see that 91% of respondents are using at least or making at least some of their strategic decisions based on data, as you would expect. Perhaps more significantly, we're focused in a lot of our studies on the 14% that you can see here that we call the data drivers, where nearly all of their strategic decisions are data driven, or nearly all their decisions are data driven. These are the companies that are out there, being very proactive about how they use data within their organization to drive decision making, throughout the organization, not just by data scientists, data analysts, senior decision makers, but by knowledge workers and domain experts throughout the company. And perhaps as you would expect, but it's always good when the data reinforces what you would expect to see. We do see that there is a correlation between the most data-driven companies and those companies that are executing when it comes to digital transformation. So if you can see here on this chart, so that in light blue we've got those data drivers where nearly all strategic decisions are data-driven. In the dark blue, we've got what we call the data drifters, companies that where very few strategic decisions are actually driven by data. And as you can see, over 70% of the most data-driven companies are in the execution stage in relation to digital transformation, compared to, I think it's about 27% of the least data-driven companies. So there really is a clear correlation between companies that are driving data-driven decision-making and also executing when it comes to digital transformation. And that's clearly not a coincidence. As far as we can see, obviously in many cases that broader digital transformation effort is a significant influence on the processes and the technology adoption that enables organizations to become more data-driven. Now, part of that move towards being more data-driven is obviously taking advantage of AI, machine learning technologies, and what I think is important about that, whilst there's a lot of huge potential obviously when it comes to AI, machine learning, particularly in terms of automating some of the most complex decision making or operations that we see within organizations. Today, particularly what we see is being used to automate some of the most mundane elements, but particularly to augment what humans are doing when it comes to, let's say, from a data analytics perspective, specifically, for example, when it comes to profiling data, or recommending visualizations, for example, or recommending obviously responses to for in terms of customer demand. So actually in many cases the actual decision is still being taken by a human in that case, but there's a lot of augmentation going on using AI machine learning, for example. When we look at the adoption of machine learning today, it's still, clearly relatively in its early stages. So we see that, 60% of organizations are not using machine learning at this point. And it's split fairly evenly, 20% between those that are currently using machine learning today and 20% who are in the proof of concept stage. But, we do get a good sense that those percentages are going to rapidly increase as we see more and more organizations looking to take advantage of machine learning. I think what we see is a lot of companies today figuring out where it fits. There's a lot of data science experimentation going on to figure out where machine learning can best be applied to their business to get the best results. We once organizations have been through those stages, we expect a rapid adoption. Now, of course, there are lots of reasons why companies are perhaps being a little bit limited in their use of machine learning today. And the number one, anecdotally, and also, as you can see here, according to our survey data that we see, is clearly the lack of skilled resources. Data scientists are few and far between and hard to come by, and I would say harder to hire, but even harder perhaps to keep hold of. But, beyond that, also what we see is finding and accessing data is a significant barrier to machine learning, ranking only behind that, the lack of skilled resources. And this is particularly challenging as data is increasingly spread across multiple environments, not just in the enterprise or throughout the enterprise, but also, throughout multiple cloud providers, multiple SaaS application providers. And it's just, increasingly difficult for organizations to identify what data they have available to them and where it is. So in addition to doing the surveys, some of which I'm, running through the results of here, we also, at 451 Research regularly engage with enterprises in terms of, longer conversations about the challenges they face. And I picked out a few sort of quotes from some of the narratives that we generate in relation to that. Obviously, they're all anonymized, so we can't account specifically who they relate to. But I think this is a really good example of what I was just talking about there. We've got an IT engineering manager talking about what is concerning is, in particular, isn't the nature of the data necessary that's being stored with partners, but just how fragmented it is. 40, 50, 60, 100 different potential SaaS providers. And so, obviously in this case, we're talking specifically about customer data, it being spread, all across those different SaaS providers. So, the ability to just find what all that data, and be aware of where it all is something that organizations are particularly challenged with. Now, interestingly, when it comes to sort of thinking about this from a regional perspective, we actually see that finding and accessing data is currently a greater challenge amongst respondents to our surveys coming from Europe, Middle East, and Africa than it is North America, and this is just one of a number of different sort of regional differences we've highlighted here, and which are relevant when we're thinking about the ability of organizations to take advantage, obviously, of the opportunities that are available to them wherever they happen to be in the world. And also we see, another one here is that actually the importance of AI and machine learning to analytics projects is actually more widely recognized currently in North America than it is amongst companies in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And perhaps as I said, because we see a correlation between being more data driven and execution in relation to digital transformation strategies. Perhaps therefore not a surprise that we see a higher proportion of enterprises in North America are actually currently executing or developing digital transformation strategies compared to those in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Actually, a pretty substantial number, 88% in the EMEA, but still, behind the 95% of North American companies. And this is something I think, over here in Europe, I think we should be very cognizant of and aware of that. There is a risk, amongst some organizations, obviously within the EMEA, of, or the risk is more substantial, perhaps, of being left behind in relation to this drive towards digital transformation. So what do we mean by that? So another, good quote here. Yeah, again, I said earlier, we talk about digital transformation. We've seen that it's something that companies are doing, but what are they actually doing? What does it mean? And I think this is a really good narrative I came across from an IT engineering manager in the manufacturing sector. What does digital transformation mean to him or her? It's about the ability to give the organization the ability to focus more on being proactive. And I think this is indicative of what we see across lots of organizations where, clearly there's been investments made over the years in data and analytics and digital technologies. But the organizations are still very actually reactive, and one of the key things that we see from the move towards being more data driven is trying to be more proactive and actually sort of preempt some of the potential challenges, and also potentially sort of preempt customer experience issues, for example, or gain competitive advantage. Now, this is another slide looking again at sort of regional differences, and here we're looking specifically at the benefits organizations are realizing from their data platforms and analytics adoption. I think what is particularly interesting about this is you've got, again, the blue is North America on the left, and the orange is Europe, Middle East, and Africa on the right. Actually, what you see is that some of these advantages are being enjoyed, or the benefits are being enjoyed more by organizations in Europe, Middle East, and Africa than they are in North America. So things like improving operational efficiency, improving customer experience, gaining competitive advantage, responding faster to opportunities and threats. And in fact, the one area actually where there's a significant difference that tips more towards North America is actually in terms of lowering costs. So I brought this up, I think, for two reasons. One is to sort of highlight that we're not saying these are good or bad. Sometimes differences are just differences. There's cultural differences, there's differences of focus, difference of perspective. As I said, they're not good or bad, but it's interesting to note what they are. But the other thing is to point out here that, actually, even though companies across Europe, Middle East, and Africa perhaps aren't declaring themselves to be executing when it comes to digital transformation or being successful with data and analytics, actually they are enjoying the benefits, and in many cases they're enjoying the benefits more than some of their North American counterparts. So it's not that clearly that companies in Europe, Middle East, and Africa aren't being successful. So it's kind of interesting when then you look at, sort of we ask companies again to rate themselves the extent to which they see themselves as being data-driven. And we see that a significantly higher proportion of enterprises in North America consider themselves amongst the most data-driven companies, 19% compared to only 10% in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And perhaps, based on what we just saw in terms of the benefits being enjoyed, there's an element here of, companies in North America just being that little bit more, let's say, sort of self-assured or willing to bang their chest about, the successes they're seeing and how data-driven they are. And perhaps companies in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, maybe not being as as vocal about the successes they're having, because as we see, they are enjoying those benefits. So it's an interesting point, and sometimes it comes down, as I say, to sort of cultural differences rather than sort of true differences in terms of technology adoption or success rate. So I wanted to roll back here just a little bit, just to finish off on, and we made the point earlier about finding and accessing data is a key barrier, particularly obviously, as I mentioned before, to adoption of AI machine learning. But it's true, in terms of any kind of generation of business insight from data. And I think this again is another quote that really speaks to that. Is that clearly, people, generally speaking, there's a much greater realization of the value of data today. All organizations get that. They know, they need to be taking more decisions based on data. The key difference, I think, when it comes to those that are actually executing, those that are being more data-driven, is the ability with speed and efficiency to get access to that data and get to the answers they need. And that's what I think ultimately sort of really differentiates the most data driven from the least data driven is the speed with which they can actually find and access that data, which brings us on to the focus on sort of search and the importance of search in relation to data and analytics generally, but AI machine learning in particular. And I think what we see is that there are significant potential benefits of natural language search as an interface for finding and accessing data. Obviously just lowers the barriers to analytic insight in terms of that use of natural language queries. In particular, there's we see a growing focus on data literacy and growing the ability of non-specialist workers within an organization to actually access and use data as part of their work, and that could be C-level executives, or it could just be less technical personnel, domain experts, to actually intuitively query data. And in particular, we see that search is particularly important in surfacing insight from unstructured data. Obviously, one of those areas which organizations have been improving their use of sort of unstructured data for business insight over the years, but still an area where there's a lot of data that actually goes perhaps unexploited in terms of generating business insight. Now, this, again, is an interesting insight here from a survey we did earlier this year, and it's just talking about sort of emerging business intelligence interfaces. And in particular, the one I wanted to point out here was actually, we phrased it in this question, natural language text interfaces. Basically, we were talking about natural language search. And what we see is, what's interesting, so in dark blue, you've got all respondents overall, and we were asking them, what was their level of interest within their organization in terms of these new interface technologies. And what was quite interesting is I was quite surprised, I must admit, that we saw only 16% of all respondents saying they had a good interest in natural language text interfaces. But what was told a whole different story is when you zeroed in on the most data-driven companies, the data drivers, as we call them here. And that, as you see across the board in terms of all these technologies, they're way ahead. But, looking at natural language text interfaces in particular, 34% of organizations with a significant interest in using natural language text interfaces as part of their analytics deployments. So again, what we see is that it's the most data-driven companies that stand to gain the most from adoption of all these interfaces into analytics, particularly also the natural language query interfaces. And back to the other point I made in terms of sort of the importance of search for generating insight from unstructured and semi-structured data, that's going to be an increasingly important capability, because we see that a growing number of enterprises are expecting to use unstructured textual data for AI machine learning over the next couple of years. So only 42% of organizations say they're using unstructured and semi-structured textual data for AI and ML today, but that is going to increase to about 88% within the next 2 years based on the respondents to our latest AI machine learning learning survey. So, as I said, that unstructured, semi-structured data has perhaps gone underexploited for many, many years, but that looks set to change considerably with the use of that data within AI machine learning projects over the next couple of years. So with that, it was obviously a bit of a rapid run through of the state of the market as we see it and various trends that we see shaping the space. So I wanted to just conclude here by just sort of summarizing some of the key trends and perhaps point to some recommendations about what organizations can do going forward. So the first thing is, as I said, digital transformation is absolutely real and it is happening. 92% of enterprises are currently executing or developing digital transformation strategies. So, if you are out there in that 8% or even that 22% that are only considering, now is, it's probably maybe even be past time to do something about it. Because there is that risk of getting left behind. But, definitely either start thinking about what the organization can do now, or alternatively perhaps start thinking about whether there's opportunities at other organizations that are being more proactive in terms of digital transformation. Secondly, we see that most data-driven companies are also taking a lead when it comes to digital transformation. I talked about the correlation there, and perhaps no surprise, but the data really highlights that it is a significant trend that the most data-driven companies are predominantly ahead in terms of executing when it comes to digital transformation. So I think enterprises that are behind with regards to making data-driven decisions, and particularly as we've seen in EMEA, where there appears to be, at the very least, perhaps a bit of some work to be done to catch up with North American companies in terms of making data-driven decisions. There is the potential to be a disadvantage there. Finding and accessing data, as we've seen, is a significant barrier to analytics and machine learning, second only to the available skills. But it is particularly, it seems to be a greater barrier to companies in Europe, Middle East, and Africa than it is in North America. And so this is an area, I think, we see across the board, companies need to step up, but, both on the vendor side and the enterprise side, this needs to be an area of focus. It's still a challenge where there's been improvements across many other areas, but there's still this challenge in terms of finding and accessing data. And as I said, in many cases, as data is increasingly spread across multiple providers, multiple clouds, multiple SaaS applications, it's actually in some ways getting more difficult. Natural language search, though, obviously, as we said, can absolutely help with that in terms of lowering those barriers to analytic insight in terms of the expertise. And as we have seen, it is set to play an increasingly important role in that it enables the surfacing of insight from unstructured data, which we see is set to play an increasing role in machine learning projects in particular. And as such, as we've seen, that it's the most data-driven companies, and so the same ones that are actually taking a lead when it comes to digital transformation also stand to gain the most from adoption of natural language query interfaces. So really reinforcing the point that if you're not in that category right now, those that are going to potentially double their benefit of being in that category. So organizations that haven't taken greater steps to be more data driven, to execute when it comes to digital transformation, really absolutely need to start thinking about how they do that and lower that gap perhaps to those that have. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Matt. I really appreciate that. It's great insight. So with that, I'm just going to actually focus on a few things that you mentioned there, because as I was listening to that track, I was thinking more about strategy. I was thinking more about data-driven, about the importance of finding and searching for information, and then how natural language and data-driven organizations really are coming to the fore. So I did want to spend a little bit of time just focusing specifically on some of the key research that Matt and his team brought out specifically in relation to COVID-19, because I think it sets the tone for pretty much the rest of this whole webinar today. And the first one is that we're already seeing such a negative impact on business, because traditional ways of doing business have been impacted significantly, and the latest research shows that's almost 78% of organizations globally. What we've also seen is a lot of people having to move to work from home strategies, which means a lot of switching in the way that information is driven to employees for operational efficiency. And also at the same time, 38% think that's going to stay like that. Obviously, we work in the IT world and the tech world, which is very virtual anyway, so no surprise for us. But at the same time, that's quite a big swing for a lot of traditional organizations. Then we look into, productivity-wise. We focused on this a lot of Lucidworks, and we're going to talk about this a little more in a second, which is that there's, typically speaking, if people don't get the access to the right information in the right sort of time frame, it rapidly affects productivity in the workplace. Gallup have done a few surveys in this area, but 62% there from 451 research is showing a downtrend in productivity. And the other two is just like IT strain on resources, the lack of budget, things like that, or whole delays in rolling out new products or new initiatives. Another important set of trends. So with that said, let's think about specifically what this means in terms of operationalizing and prioritizing what we spend time working on in that environment. So the first one is, the way I think about it is, creating a single unified source of information, statement of truth, if you like, which includes customer data. That's really important for the workplace. We'll talk a little bit more about commerce in a second. And then the second is, making sure that we provide insight to line of business so that people make the right set of informed decisions. Part of the challenge in certainly environments we're in today is that people don't have access to the right information and therefore can't make the right decisions more rapidly. So really what this translates to, in essence, is connecting people to the right set of data insight. Now, before, and by before I meant if we look back, certainly over the last 15 years, it's been fairly easy to do that. Most information or key sets of information is in certain systems. Those systems typically operationalized through particular applications. Intranets have been a blessing, really, in the sense of being able to coordinate some form of access, maybe consistently. That was fine. But when we look at the world we live in today, with the amount of different sources of information people use, need, and actually operationalize to do their job, it's considerably more challenging. And therefore, what we need is systems that can actually transcend from a digital perspective across all of these environments, unstructured, semi-structured data sets, whether coming from applications, the internet, external, internal sources, and operationalize that and to move it into a framework that we can gain insight, find information quickly to empower the end user and the employee. So that's the sort of world we live in. Now, really, what are the challenges with that? Well, I've spent a lot of my career, over 20 years, in big data, data warehousing and analytics. And one of the challenges with taking any data from one environment into another is how long is it going to take and what skills am I going to need? And the challenge with this is if we take the traditional view of big data, which is embedded, structured data, extracting that, putting it into a data lake, doing some data cleansing or data cleaning, then moving that into cube models where we do some maybe aggregation, and then we apply that some form of a markup or ontology or taxonomy against that, and we then move it into an analytics framework, and yada, yada, yada. You end up with this whole process taking a tremendous amount of time. In fact, the average project on this type of transformation can take well over 12 to 14 months. Well, just look at where we are today. I mean, we haven't got 12 to 14 months in most organizations to transform rapidly. Now, I call this the last mile problem because we spend so much time getting data to a point where we can do something with it. We miss out on the real opportunity, which is actually to give people insight as quickly as possible and the business alignment. So what we focus on, certainly at Lucidworks, is how we spend less time on the last mile problem and more time focusing on insight. Now, of course, insight itself has different meanings, but essentially, it's really about getting information into a view that the business understands. And focusing on that in a fraction of time is the most important thing. So how do we do that? Well, this is where AI, machine learning, and some of the things that we've just been talking about earlier and Matt alluded to really start to make sense. And we'll get into these in a second. So I often think at this point it's a bit Shakespearean. That the point is, when we do transformation like this and we're thinking about how we solve that last mile problem, do we need to use AI or do we not? And what type of role does it take? Well, let's just think about that a little bit from the point of view of machine learning, which is a sort of dimension of AI or a subcategory of AI. Machine learning today and the way people think about AI in general, it has basically three themes that I think of from my perspective. One of them is, how reliable is the data? And this is a bit like a sausage machine. You put bad data in, you get bad stuff out, bad recommendation out. So data needs to be cleansed real time in order for it to be effective. The second part is making people comfortable with it. Machine learning isn't, as we'll come on to in a second, isn't the sort of Terminator type scenario with robots. It's more about making the data better, marking it up, adding more metadata to the data to make it more meaningful, and then surfacing insight, clustering, classification that makes the data pop and become alive from an insight point of view. That's important. And then the last one is really about operationalizing the AI to meet the needs of the business. Now, this is really important for this solving the last mile challenge. If you look back at that previous slide I was talking about, the challenge of big data is we spend so much time getting data into an operational state, we spend less time focusing on what the end user needs. The difference with the latter solution, when we focus on more insight-driven approaches, is we start with the business user and then we work backwards because the data is already in a format that will allow us to make it more insightful. And that's important because it meets the needs of the business more quickly. So thinking about that, other challenges to think about is functional. So sometimes business leaders really don't understand the priorities around AI. So we spend, and really search projects. So we spend a lot of time on education and making people aware of that. It's sometimes very difficult to integrate or machine learning or search-driven projects in an organization because people don't understand what it means. Then, of course, there's the whole data scientist model, which is people spend a lot of time on the math side of it and understand that very well, but don't necessarily understand how that relates to business objectives. In other words, how do people want to view stuff? What does it look like in a particular visualization? And so on. And then last thing, from an IT point of view, is sometimes that we don't get the right compute space in, or it's about aligning the right data science needs to the right type of compute and therefore not overstraining the IT department, but also making the IT teams understand what it means to go and implement this, particularly something we'll come on to in a second called signals, which is a real cornerstone of machine learning and AI. So really what it comes down to is about how we operationalize this, and search and AI are key components of a journey that people take when they operationalize, and we're going to talk a little bit about this in a second. So the first sort of myth to dispel is that when we talk about AI, we are talking about some very different things in terms of how people view it in the marketplace. One view of them is what we call narrow intelligence from an AI perspective, and the other one is broad general intelligence, which is more around the robotic side of things and the Terminator taking over the world scenario. What we're focused on very much, certainly from a search vendor and an insight vendor perspective, is obviously the former, because it's really about making the data become more valuable. What is it that we know about that information that will make it more useful to the business? For example, a piece of data on a clinical trial with a particular individual, as we're going through this right now, around a particular drug test is useful, but knowing demographically how that's implemented in different states around the world, for example, what it means to have that with different ethnicity involved, age groups, that makes the data more real versus did someone recover or not from the use of a drug. Those types of things are really more insightful, and it's that type of machine learning, that type of insight that really can be powerful. So we tend to focus a lot more at Lucidworks on what we call machine learning, and really as a good definition of what that means. It's a method of data analysis that really automates analytics. It's about AI, but in the sense of AI that really builds a model that learns from the data. So whether that's applying an ontology or some form of taxonomy or looking at entities of data and then relating that to natural language so that it can be easily parsed to answer questions. Much more effectively, we'll talk about Q&A systems in a second. it's all of that, but trying to do it without a lot of human intervention, because that's what typically slows the process down. And again, I'll give you some good examples in a minute. So first of all, what do we mean by implementation of machine learning? Well, I mean, this is a good sort of graphical illustration of what that represents. Well, we need to take data in, we need to clean it, we need to understand how it relates to each other. We then need to understand how we train that data, and there's two different thought processes. There's supervised and unsupervised. Supervised is where we have a reference point, we start with it. Unsupervised is where we use deep learning to sort of tease out the value of the information and then train it. And then there's also how we want to present the data, which is, it's great to have data about things like demographics or data that's to do with maybe a whole way that an employee needs to work from home. But how do we present it? Do we present it in a search box? Do we present it in frequently asked questions? Do we do a chat bot? Do we represent how effective people are in accessing information as a visual chart? Or do we do, say, financial services, where we have a know your customer type portal, where we give people information that way so they can better manage their interaction with their clients? Different ways that we need to represent that. And I mentioned earlier, as a result, when we implement things, it's a journey, and it starts off with keyword search. Typically, most people who are maybe in the situation we're in right now, how do they get information to the people? Well, bring all the applications together into an environment where they can search on something that they've got access to see, respecting boundaries of security and geographical consideration, like GDPR, but moving to a model where we can go and implement a search effectively so people can find something. Then we move that to a model where we're applying a taxonomy, which is an organizational structure, and maybe extracting entities so that we can start relating that in different languages or pulling out meaning of information and then applying sort of semantic-based search against that. Then we use queries. What a query intents? Well, it means that we're starting to understand what somebody might ask for in advance and then predict what those responses would be. So we're starting to curate content. We're starting to make recommendation around what somebody might want to see. This is how e-commerce sites work today. So, for instance, Harry Potter isn't involved when you go to Amazon or when you go to some of these big sites, and they miraculously come up with a number of suggestions based on what you've been looking at. For example, you might have watched a horror movie one day, and then the next day it's offering up genre books in horror for you to go and read on Audible or have through your Kindle account. That's a very good example of where some insight and some query intent and prediction is surfacing up recommendation. The next stage beyond that is relevancy tuning. What does that mean? It means making the thing more accurate, so that if you're searching for something, that you come back with the things that you really want to see. If I'm doing a home improvement project at home, and as I'm doing right now actually, with all the time I have on my hands at the weekend, and I'm remodeling a bathroom, for example, then the fact that I'm buying tile might mean that I need a tile cutter, or it might mean I need other things that relate to decoration or plumbing or things that relate to remodeling the bathroom. That's relevancy tuning my search and content so that I get more accuracy. And then the final step is really self-learning. What does that mean? It means that it's unattended. I don't have to sit there as would happen with typical merchandising online and have to curate all the time content to say, I want somebody to see this, I want somebody to see that, unless it was something maybe a promotion or some sort of new product. But it self-learns. It realizes that, hey, somebody searched on this one thing yesterday, therefore somebody else might want to see this tomorrow, therefore I'll remember it and I'll make that recommendation. So this maturity curve is really important. Now, we've got an expert in our company called Chow, and she runs our whole data science team, but she has a theory around what it means to go and implement a really great system for this type of solution. And it really starts with a platform. Let's focusing on a search as an embedded capability first, rather than just trying to get a collection of tools together. And this is the theme I'm going to take through in the last few slides here before we finish today. So first of all, if you started on the left of this typical slide and you wanted to move to the right, so you have a bunch of data like we talked about earlier, the last mile problem, and you want to get it into a workplace scenario because we want to give it to the end user, typically you'd have to go through some of these concepts. And you're going through maybe indexing data, facet clustering, natural language, signals, machine learning. And each one of these represents typically a development cycle in your organization that takes time. What we've done typically at Lucidworks is really turn this on its head. So we've built that into a hyper-personalized platform for machine learning. And what we mean by that is that we're addressing head-on through automation ways that you can tailor content to fit the needs of your employees without a lot of effort. It's point and click. You can rewrite rules and dynamically optimize how people utilize that data and search for it. And secondly, we can start making machine learning and AI much more predictive and get into the realms of recommendation and learning by remembering and what people do and really finding better ways to curate that content back to them. So this is what it means. And good examples of what implementation looks like in that area is if we start thinking about maybe the workplace world and the commerce world. So predictive merchandising, the ability to really rewrite queries around how people search for something. So remembering that one day somebody searched for a blue dress and they got a blue vase back, and tomorrow they actually get things that were blue clothing related, and we remember that. Might sound simplistic, but believe it or not, many search engines fail with that, or they get spelling mistakes, or they come back with 0 results. Those are really bad environments for doing commerce. Catalog searching, sentiment analysis, using natural language, allowing people to ask questions and assistance in chatbot. And then on the flip side, more around, in the research and solving problems like supply chain or surfacing areas where information isn't really being coordinated in the right way. Also, like banking compliance, level 3 compliance in a bank, for instance, is a very manually intensive process, but really it's just about bringing information together. So these are really good examples of where we go solve for a particular problem. So what we do at Lucidworks, we have a platform called Fusion, and this is really where we get into sort of the automation side of what we do. And within Fusion, we are delivering all of those boxes in between the left and the right-hand side automatically. It becomes a point-and-click environment where we ingest data effectively. We allow you to prep it and organize it or intuitively. And what does that mean? It means that working out that one piece of data from a structured database is the same as another piece of data sitting inside an email. That is the same as another piece of data that's in a textual logging stream from another network device, for example. And it's the same thing. So we relate the data together, put it in an inverted index, create a UI so you can search that very quickly on keyword search or type ahead or things that relate to surfaced insight. Then we get into machine learning. So we have over 12 different types of machine learning algorithms that allow you to surface insight by just applying it immediately, clustering, classification. Then visualize that in the right way so we get to the point where you are able to deliver a solution, solve that last mile problem in about 92, 93% less time. And that's really what it's about today. That's what insight technology gives you, the ability to do that. And of course, as we think about what that means from an AI point of view, then of course there's a lot of capabilities that we provide, and I don't intend to go into all of these today. Certainly we can have follow-on conversations in this area, but there are a lot of things that we do that are really important in this process about data ingestion and cleansing, which is about things like anomaly detection, making sure we understand the value of data, how we store it, how we scale that. I mean, the e-commerce world, how we boost around things like Black Friday so that we can cope with demand, but not necessarily when it's not really needed. How we learn from the data, how we align that to what the user wants to go implement and what that means. And then, of course, the right UI. Is it an embedded model? Is it something we need to particularly build for analysts in an organization as well? But there are two things that I really wanted to focus on a little bit just before I finish here. One of them is machine learning for anomaly detection. What does this mean? It means that of that last mile problem you saw earlier on when we try and implement these digital transformation projects, and think about what this would take for an organization today to go and do that if you've got data in multiple systems. The biggest thing you're going to face with is what does this piece of data mean in one system related to 3 or 4 other systems or other sources of data, and how do we anomalize that so that the data is understood to mean the same thing, that we can relate it to the same ontology, for example. We do that automatically through anomaly detection. We help you cleanse that data real time, and we call it a pipeline process. So that solves a huge amount of effort out of the gate, although it still needs to be done. We still need to map data, but it's not to the same extent as it would be as if you were trying to extract or transform data in the big data world. The second thing that I think is important is to really, how do we do machine learning? Well, we use something called signals. Now, signals is part of our baseline technology called Solar and Apache Spark. But what it means is that we're remembering every type of behavior that a user or an employee interacts with around that data and using it to train the data automatically. So it becomes much more accurate, much more relevant. And it allows us to effectively rewrite the anticipated queries on the way people would search or want to find for data. So really important aspect of the technology as well. Now, with that said, I just wanted to bring this all together into what this sort of environment looks like when you start to plug it together. And of course, we've only got limited time to go through all of this today, so I'm just going to focus very much on use case examples after this. But, the idea is that you can rapidly assemble solutions that you need for your workforce dynamically, whether you're building a Q&A solution, and we have a Fusion chatbot solution, for example, that can train off of a couple of thousand pairs of Q&A to deliver a result within just days. Most of the time we're doing what you're seeing on screen now, using all the capabilities we've talked about and delivering a particular workplace solution within days typically, just because we can automate so much of it. Now, in summary then, when we talk about experiences, we think about customer care, some of those examples we talked about earlier, but I just wanted to finish up with just some examples. So we've got 3 examples here. The first one was PwC, very much in a situation we're in right now, but of course, with a virtual workforce, wanting to bring together a client perspective on everything that they have about their working environment for employees, both in place in the workplace, but also virtual as well. And that was the solution they implemented with Fusion very quickly. 10 million documents virtualized and made available to employees. Another one is Red Hat. This is a very good example of call deflection. If anybody goes to Red Hat today and you ask a question or you do a search, that's Fusion powered. And underneath that, we put some really important data points. For instance, reducing the infrastructure by almost 300 or 400%, reducing the number of support tickets, call deflection, so scaling when demand occurs without the need for additional staff, and obviously, maintaining a massive benefit in terms of cost of ownership. And then the last scenario was just an example more on the commerce side, which is Vegas.com, where this was all about conversion. It's about click-through rates. It's about merchandising. It's about curating commerce buying experience. But the bottom line there is how long people spend on their websites, what people buy, and is it the right type of experience for them? And again, you can see some good data points here in terms of improvement in visitors and conversion. So with that, we've come to the end of the session. I think we have a few minutes left for questions here. So I'll open this back up, and hopefully Sabrina's on the line here and Kate, and can see if we have any questions come in.
Thanks, Simon. I am indeed. We have quite a few questions, actually. We may not get round to all of them in the 4 minutes. So if so, don't fret. We will follow up post-webinar via email with answers. But the first one that came in was, what are the main business drivers for companies to embrace AI?
Okay, very interesting, but most of the time, very good question, by the way, whoever asked that one, so thank you for that. The business drivers usually are to curate content in form of AI, which, we talk about the models we talked about earlier, which is very much about operationalized AI. If we think about it in that context, it's about how do they create learning models to improve relevancy. That tends to be one of the bigger drivers that we see. And the important aspect of that is just go to a commerce site today. Go and start typing and searching for things and see how accurate they are. I mean, it becomes very evident very quickly who has the best sites and who doesn't. Well, underneath that, the ones that actually have good sites where they can really understand what you mean, maybe if you've misspelled it, maybe if you're using different language, maybe if you reorder the words in which you're searching, or you just ask a question and come back with the right response. That's not by accident. Behind that is an AI model and a driver that's helping you convert your buying intention, your buying need to something that will ultimately allow you to click something through that process. Now, in the workplace, again, slightly different. It's about accuracy. So we've got so many examples here, but one that comes to mind, I can't use the customer name, is a very large oil and gas company globally that save over $1 billion every year using Fusion to go and curate the right employee experience. And fundamentally what they're able to do is resolve duplicate R&D effort on the same type of research by making people aware that when they search for something, that all of this stuff already exists and they can curate it to the individual. And that's not just about simple search, because it's about really understanding the true nature of the data and then orientating it around clusters or classifications of content that relate to that topic. So this is all AI in the back end. It's all business drivers to improve efficiency, improve conversion rates. It's improving and reducing infrastructure costs that otherwise you would just be growing out of control. Any other questions?
Thanks, Simon. Yeah. In North America, companies operate in English and a single currency. In Europe, there are multiple languages and currencies, especially at the customer level, and mining sentiment, etc., from call center transcripts. Indeed, a minority of employees and customers in Europe speak English as their first language. As a result, European companies have to run ML in multiple languages. I'd be interested to know your views on the impact of having to work in multiple languages and what that will have on AI ML adoption.
Great. Well, that's just such an excellent question given the topic today. So how does this transcend across Europe? And you know, I'm a British person, but I speak a few languages as well. But all I will say to you is that you know, inside of Fusion, we support 32 different linguistic sets of different languages, and we have I think over 14 to 16 different types of entity extraction. So in the context of what that means to you, it means that we are able to basically translate what somebody searches for and what the meaning and content of what they need from all of those languages back to their base language set that they've searched on. So if you're searching in English, but some of the content was in Chinese, or it's in Hungarian, or it's in Turkish, or it's in German, or it's in French, then you get the response translated back in English, even though the data set was stored in another language. And we also look at the meaning of that from the point of natural language. So even if you ask a question, like for instance, you know, what's the current rate of research and development on COVID-19 cures in Germany, for example, and I'm asking that in French, for example, you get the results back in French, even though it's expressed as a question. So we thought about that in advance. And it's no accident that Lucidworks are the AI and search specialists in this area. We've been doing it for many years, and all of that is embedded in our technology.
We have had one more just come through now. We are 1 minute past the hour, but if we can quickly answer, then we can wrap up. Do you provide a component approach, i.e., is it possible to leverage only a part of your solution, or would a customer always have to implement your entire engine? Example, somebody using Solar ES as their main engine and leveraging your AI capabilities.
It's a very good question. So the short answer is yes. I mean, our whole background as a company is built from Solar experience, and in fact, you know, we didn't want to spend too much time on that today, but you know, Lucidworks as a whole, you know, we used to write a lot of the source code for Solar, we still do, and we have a lot of the committers for Solar. So we're very into Solar, particularly. What does that mean? It means that we support Solar. We have a number of Solar customers. We still help them manage their environments. That does mean that Fusion integrates to those environments. So it doesn't mean you have to use it all. Some people just use it for ML enrichment. Some people actually implement the whole of the Fusion environment. I think the big question comes is, sure, Fusion's a platform, but it's built with different applications and thought process in mind of the componentry that you need. So you can sort of pick and choose what you want. And a good example is Q&A. So if you want to implement a virtual assistant today, there's a variety of ways of doing that. Some which will obviously leverage Fusion as a primary sort of interaction. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to have the whole of Fusion environment spread across all of your data set if you don't need it.
Lovely, thank you. And with that, we have come to the end of the hour and the end of the webinar. The session has been recorded and we will make it available to you all after the fact. Of course, if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Simply email teameurope@lucidworks.com and we will get back to you. We thank you for joining us today and we wish you all well. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Matt.